congratulate the two teams who have made it to the final round of this tournament. It's quite an accomplishment for you both. Welcome. And with that, we will get started, and I will call upon the Most Honorable Prime Minister to deliver the first constructive speech of the round, not to exceed 7 minutes in length.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Thank you very much. Of course, thank you to NYU for this wonderful tournament. I know I've seen some truly monumental rounds unfold up here, so it is an honor and also humbling to be up here. John, my partner, is going to give you a great speech. Friends on the side, opposition, for it's going to be a great round. And Nita Johnson, again, for carrying me through these out rounds with this timer. So we have a pretty simple case statement for you. What we want to suggest is that the world should abandon the Kyoto Protocol as it exists in the current form. So we have 3 reasons why we believe that this should be the case. And the first reason we have is the genius of the global market. Because what John and I would say is usually when humanity is confronted with problems, they don't simply step back from the position that they've taken, but they rather use their technological ingenuity to discover and find solutions that rectify the problems that we've encountered through our own development. John and I see no reason why this same philosophy shouldn't be applied in the issue of climate change as well. And I think if you look at the way the problem has been framed by proponents of the Kyoto Protocol, it's often been said that the growth that occurs is of course good, but that it's perhaps unsustainable, that something needs to be done to curtail the problems associated with this to the extent that we are able to continue to have the degrees of prosperity and growth that we do now. But there's a significant flaw in this logic, and the flaw relies on the notion that the world as we see it in the future, as we see it being unsustainable, looks very much like the present today, and doesn't include a certain variable that's required in sort of predicting out these kinds of situations. A perfect example of this is the analysis of Thomas Malthus, which seemed perfectly reasonable and perfectly understandable, that growth, since it grew exponentially with regards to food, which grew geometrically and didn't, sorry, I got that wrong, algebraically. I never did very well in math. That in fact, there would be some doomsday scenario. But of course, even though all the time I hear again and again throughout history these Malthusian predictions, they never come true. Because of course, no one is able to properly account for the human ingenuity that could proceed along those same lines and make these solutions sustainable, where in the present they might have those. So I think if you look at the key features of markets, in fact, they are systems to produce, designed in many ways, to produce precisely this kind of technological innovation. Because of course, when people say, look, it's unsustainable, there's a problem here, there might be some doomsday end to things. That's the exact kind of incentive that's always spurred on technological inquiry to satisfy and solve these problems in the past. What we'd say is this is exactly what we can expect from the market in this precise situation. Of course, we can look to smaller examples, such as Japan, I think is a great example. They have a lot of environmental limitations due to the nature of their geography and the limited landmass they have. They have the most extensive recycling program in the world. They have enormous environmental movements on that island. And I think you can recognize that the kinds of pressures that the environment apply to the sustainability of the Japanese economy have been what have motivated these changes to allow the Japanese to continue to grow at these extraordinary rates, not recently, but in general. And have enabled them to continue to have the kind of prosperity that they've always had. Sure.
Isn't it true, Mike, though, that the results of global warming have been especially disastrous for nations that are developing, especially because they've in many cases decimated agricultural industries that are just beginning to develop in these regions?
Right. John will talk a lot about this because I'm not going to get to most of it in my case. But I think the essential point here is that there are a lot of problems like sub-Saharan Africa, and that in fact, I think we need to take a broader notion of how we can potentially develop, human technology to be able to aid the development of these nations that is clearly doing an insufficient job in the status quo, and climate change that could potentially occur is probably not going to make a huge difference in the long-term development of these nations, given that there are so many other problems that are restricting their development. But we'd say that simply stated, there are in fact this kind of restriction hurts economies. It's estimated that the Kyoto Protocol is costing the world $500 billion annually. And I think if you just recognize the kinds of resources that are required to be devoted to the reduction of these pollution emissions, and also just like the reduction in economic efficiency due to that, we see a tremendous cost that's necessarily incurred. We think that money can be better used towards the kinds of innovative solutions that John and I would like to see implemented. I'll give you a few examples of these. Now let me make it clear. Some of these may strike you as sort of crack science, but I think in fact we're moving along the dimensions of starting to actually approach this problem with an interesting set of creative ideas that might possibly be able to solve the problem. For instance, it has been written in scientific journals that potentially we could set up an enormous satellite to cover just one equatorial band that would have variable controls on it to allow certain degrees of sunlight into the Earth system. Makes perfect sense in theory. They estimate it would cost $500 billion, which is what we spend annually on the Kyoto Protocol. Another example, white paint. It's been estimated that if we put white paint on every paved surface across the entire globe, we could reduce global temperatures by 1% by deflecting some rays. I'm
actually curious, what in the world are you saying, right? Are you saying that or are you saying that basically there are a lot of pie-in-the-sky theories that maybe are written by some dude who's sitting around and thinks it sounds like a cool idea?
I would say that these theories seem only strange insofar as they are novel. If you actually look at them, you have plenty of time later. If you actually examine the logic behind them, they make perfect sense. But you think, wow, that's crazy, because everyone's been talking about reducing global emissions by just putting more scrubbers on things and reducing global economic efficiency. But if we try and align our thoughts and our creative notions along a more creative path, we can possibly come up with something. The last thing I'd like to say is simply that there's a tremendous amount of problems with relation to fossil fuels being used up, and there will of course be a certain price incentive along those dimensions to wean us off those things. And we'd like to see the market exercise its genius in that manner. Second thing I want to talk about is how this is incredibly ineffective. It's just not working, right? Well, we can point to the fact that basically no one in Europe is meeting their emission targets. In fact, many nations are about 20% over the targets that they've had. And only Britain and other countries that have had really low emission targets because of economic collapses in Eastern Europe have been able to meet this. I think, in fact, in many ways, this drains, saps support from the notion of these treaties, the environmental cause as a whole, when we see what a complete failure it is. Of course, there's also the problem of the migration of industry to the third world, and not just the third world, but the United States and Australia, which hasn't signed on to these treaties, and you still have the same amount of pollution as movement is incentivized across those lines and those dimensions. Also, because we already have the problems of outsourcing, the problems of migration of industrial capacity, I think there could be an enormous backlash against the environmental movement. The last thing I'd say is simply, it's unnecessary to assume that global warming is a bad thing. Why is that? Because there's no reason to assume that the current state of global climate is the optimal one. I look at most of the landmass that exists on the Earth. It's mostly permafrost in the very northern part of the northern hemisphere. Perhaps we could get a lot out of that. We should at least examine those polygons. For these reasons, we're kind of
I thank the Prime Minister for his remarks and now call upon the Honourable Leader of the Opposition to deliver a speech not exceeding 8 minutes in length.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. If you had told me, a 5-year-old poor Jewish boy growing up in Minnesota, that on February 2nd in New York City, 3rd, it would be 60 degrees, he would say, you're talking bupkis. He would say, there's no way. So it is something actually that does concern me personally. I am very worried about rising global temperatures, and it's something I've given a lot of thought to, so I'm very happy that they've decided to bring this up for debate. I do, of course, want to thank NYU, thank our opponents, and thank Josh as well. And my first point is going to be the Talmudic perspective on global warming. I'll be here all week. I'm kidding, actually. Is why the market will not solve the problem of global warming. This, I think, is critical for why we need to keep the Kyoto Treaty. It's very, very simple. The market works great in a lot of situations to allocate resources to get the most efficient outcome. When doesn't it work? Well, it's when there's a conflict of interest or a collective action problem, and we think that's what's occurring right now. Specifically, there's a prisoner's dilemma. A country basically is confronted with two choices. It can either, one, build dikes and seawalls and essentially prevent global warming, which would lead to rising ocean levels from coming into the country, or it could choose to cut emissions. Now, cutting emissions is very, very, very expensive, and there's no guarantee that everyone else will cut emissions too. But if you just build rising seawalls, it's relatively cheap, and you can prevent the consequences of of higher emissions, meaning higher sea levels, from hurting the country. The problem, though, is that means every rich country that's able to build these walls will do so, but the poor countries are left behind. They can't build the walls. That means sea levels rise, hurt the countries, and there's no one who's going to be willing to take action to protect them. So we think the market will not solve if there's a collective action problem. There is a collective action problem because every individual country has the incentive not to cut emissions, to shirk their obligation, and instead to build things like higher sea. The second argument we want to give you is that there's not a foreseeable alternative to Kyoto. There's already an international consensus. The Kyoto Treaty recently came online as the number of signatories passed the set percentage that were required for activation. So at the point where it's already going to come online, it seems very strange to scrap it, especially because these countries have already committed to meet these targets. Now, they get up here and tell us there's very easy ways to meet these targets. They could paint their country white. They could put a giant metal belt around the earth. That's fine. It doesn't mean they can't do that with the Kyoto Treaty. They're going to tell you have to achieve this by cutting emissions. We think the Kyoto Treaty actually provides a way, like you could explore alternative ways of cutting emissions under the Kyoto Treaty. Furthermore, we think that there's a very easy way to cut emissions in a way that's market friendly, namely to establish an institution or system of emissions credit trading. What does that mean? That Kyoto countries could actually harness the market themselves in addition to these other policies which would cut emissions or cut the effects of global warming. They could do things like have companies that pollute a lot trade or buy credits from companies that are very efficient. That's harnessing the power of the market. That's avoiding the prisoner's dilemma by having countries sign in to reduce emissions, use the market to get the most efficiency, and we think that's something that you should be proud of also. The third argument that we want to make is that this would embolden opponents of stopping global warming, specifically people like the Bush administration or China and India, all of whom, no thank you, who've been pushing to scrap the Kyoto protocols. President Bush, remember, withdrew entirely and didn't negotiate. We think it sends the completely wrong message to opponents of environmental change. We think you should not say scrap the treaty. We should say there are other ways we can explore in tandem with the treaty. We know the treaty can work. We know there are economically viable ways of promoting things like emissions trading. You can also put a giant metal belt around the earth or paint yourself white if you so choose. We think you can do that alongside Kyoto, and we're not seeing any unique benefit to violating it. Remember, these countries agreed to sign it. They want to cut their emissions. They cut their emissions the most efficient way possible.
Okay, a while ago you were talking about the message it sends. What kind of message does it send about the project of Kyoto as a whole if no one is able to meet the emission requirements?
But first of all, it seems strange because your argument is that if you set a target, the market will solve. As soon as you set a target, then industries in Japan, industries in Europe have an incentive to develop economically viable, economically profitable ways of meeting those targets. If a country developed a true source of alternative energy, imagine the economic benefits it could reap. President Clinton made exactly this point in a speech soon after he left office. We could sell that to China. We could sell that to India. There are huge economic incentives that we actually spur by setting targets that are required to meet. We get out of the collective action problem, and we think that's a great reason to keep the Kyoto protocols. All right, so look to the first argument on their side of the flow, where they talk about the genius of the global market, and they talk about Malthus. Well, we think it's different because we've actually addressed a very clear argument why the market doesn't work. It's because there is a collective action problem. There's no incentive for someone to build a $500 billion belt around the earth if they don't have to meet a certain target. But there is an incentive if they sign onto a treaty to meet that target. We've given you several ways they can do it, and we've told you why rejecting the treaty will decrease that incentive, not only for the countries who don't sign it, but for every single country who then will say, I will just shirk under the assumption that other countries will pay for the benefits that I can then receive. Furthermore, we think it's uniquely bad for poor regions. The market's fine, but not when it leaves behind countries like sub-Saharan Africa, countries that have been struggling for decades to get out of poverty. We think there's a real equity issue here, that the countries of the global north, Japan, Europe, the United States, and so forth, do have a real obligation to help protect the environment for other countries. They've recognized that obligation by signing the treaty. It seems very perverse to say that obligation doesn't exist anymore because we discovered that white paint is reflective. The second is that there are other ideas we could use to solve. And so we think that's fine too. You can pursue those ideas. You can also pursue ideas to reduce emissions targets. We think that if the net effect is the same, you can pursue both ways. And at the point where one isn't necessary, you can move to the other. But we think that there are good reasons that you would be pursuing the Kyoto Protocol. One, it's already online. Two, it's already got majority support. Three, it offers you the opportunity to use a lot of really attractive market mechanisms like carbon emissions trading, which we think is profitable for economies, create new industries, and could be used to help the the entire world. The second argument they give is that it's ineffective, that no one in Europe has has actually met their targets. Well, that's fine because the targets aren't coming online for a while. It's a long-term treaty. No, thank you. We think that there's lots of different ways countries could do it in a more excuse me, there's lots of different ways countries could meet the targets. Just because they're not doing it right now doesn't mean it won't. Furthermore, we think this just argues for more enforcement. We think that it's more important that countries actually attempt to meet the targets. It seems very strange to say that if the technology is there, if the possibilities for an emissions trading system is there, are there, and should be set up, we're not going to set up anything. We're going to junk the treaty, and we don't really see why you would do that. The next argument they give you is that we shouldn't assume the current state is optimal. Well, here's what we should assume. We know the world works pretty well right now. We also know that a lot of people are concentrated on the coastline. A lot of cities are concentrated on the coastline. Now, the permafrost region might be a great place to live. Living in Minnesota, I can vouch for that. It's very hard to move a city to the permafrost region. So even though it might be better in some sort of, if we were starting ex nihilo, if we moved from behind a veil of ignorance, we might want to use that land, but we've already developed land on the coast, and I don't want to flood London or Paris. Paris isn't on the coast. I don't want to flood coastal cities in order to actually generate what they think is a more optimal distribution of land. Furthermore, we think that people who are poor, who can't afford to move to the permafrost regions, are the very people who get affected most by this. So again, we think it goes back to that equity issue. Furthermore, we think that there are huge potential problems, like if the Gulf Stream, which transmits warm water from North America to Europe, if that shuts down, then we could have huge cooling all across the world. So global warming is not that the whole planet gets warmer and suddenly areas that were covered by frost yesterday are now blooming and verdant prairies. Global warming could mean that all of Western Europe, parts of North America, parts of Canada become inhospitable and economically unviable because the temperatures plummet so much as the Gulf Stream shuts down. We think it's another reason that it's very important to meet these emissions, that we've given you the tools to meet those emissions deadlines, and that there's no reason to scrap them in favor of some else.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition for his remarks, and now call upon the Member of Government to deliver a speech not to exceed 8 minutes in length.
Thanks, everyone. What a wonderful weekend. Of course, the first weekend the reason this weekend has been wonderful is it's been a fantastic debate tournament. I've loved debating with Mike, and I'm really enjoying this final round. But didn't you guys all just really appreciate the balmy weather it's been having in New York? I think it's really made the experience a whole lot more palatable. So this is one of those unfortunate situations where I feel like the constraints of an 8-minute speech really just don't allow me to fully address the inadequacies of the previous speaker. But I'm going to do my best to talk about 3 independent points. The first one is the market will not solve. Basically a direct response to our independent points. So really there are 2 independent points. The first thing that they talk about is a collective action problem. But I first want to address the idea of the seawalls. He gives us this brilliant example. He says, think about this collective action problem. The rich countries can all afford to build seawalls. They're not that expensive. We can do it around our coastal cities, only a few of them. Pretty cheap process that we've developed there. But the poor countries, they can do nothing. Wow, what a perfect example of the genius of the market system. We've developed in the first world this system of seawalls that the first world can create and produce cheaply and can conceivably export to the third world for those few cities that are actually below or near sea level. So I think this is really just a perfect example for why what appears to be a collective action problem only appears that way because environmentalists have gotten our thinking quite narrowed about the nature of tackling environmental problems. It seems as though these first world economic structures built around efficiency and built around technological advancement and research have now discovered something that we can successfully export to the third world. So not too credible a point. But what does he really say? He says there's a collective action problem. That's the essence of this point. I actually don't think the collective action problem exists to that degree. To the degree to which disaster will ensue upon these economies, the actors, the members, the constituents of those economies, and the stakeholders in these economies have an incentive to avoid disaster on a couple levels. First, it's just often quite profitable for companies to move toward environmentally efficient ways of operating. Mike talked about the way in which recycling companies in Japan have been incredibly profitable because, in fact, the reason why dumping was so difficult to do in Japan was exactly congruent with, and in fact the same reason as, the reason why developing effective ways of recycling was incredibly profitable. So I think the companies will continue to do these things, and at the very least, their products will have a buyer. world governments. If world governments can come together for Kyoto and decide it's okay to pay this extravagant cost to avoid this collective action problem, then I think companies will be interested in researching tools to sell these world governments at a much, much lower cost and in a much more efficient manner. So I don't think this collective action problem exists. I think it's a facade perpetrated by the opposition. So that said, the second thing that we hear is that there's no alternative. Well, that's funny. I thought that Mike's PMC was laying out many alternatives, including the status quo, which is doing pretty good, sort of sans or prior to Kyoto. But what do we hear specifically? We hear, number one, these countries are already committed. Don't squander that commitment. Well, unfortunately, that political commitment is among the biggest weaknesses of Kyoto, because it paints the failures of Kyoto, the failures to meet these idealistic, ridiculous emissions goals, as in fact emblematic of the naivety and idealism of the environmental movement as a whole. I think it saps energy from any movement attempting to organize people against legitimate collective action problems and actually help the government and actually help the environment. Sure.
John, I'm not actually advocating for this position. I'm just exposing it as what you should be arguing for. If you're really that supportive of the idea of doing nothing about global warming whatsoever, wouldn't you then love Kyoto? Because it would end all opposition to global warming policies throughout the entire world?
No. Environmental movement is a good movement in some areas. We think they ought to maybe redirect their energies. I think this portrait of the idealistic and naive environmentalist applies across environmental issues. So I don't think that ad hoc attack is really all that. The next thing that we hear is, oh, well, they want to co-opt our analysis. They say, fine, use technology. We can use technology to meet our quotas. A couple problems with this analysis. First, the quotas are pretty short term. They're like 5 years away. The quotas actually come into place in 2010, by which time all of the Kyoto signatories have to be below their 1990 levels. So in fact, not only do we have to stop growing and put a freeze on emissions growth, we have to retard back 20 years to a way in which we weren't before in a previous economy. Using technology won't operate that fast. Mike and I are willing to admit that 5 years is not the time scale we're talking about. You can't use this technology or this genius of the market to fix this problem in 5 years. So I don't think that's the right way to go on this. The next thing that they talk about under this point is the emissions trading. There's not a whole lot to it. I think they basically just wanted to use the word market in association with an idea of environmentalism and somehow, sort of like co-opt all our argumentation. Now, emissions trading, it's a good case. I've seen it run. But frankly, the benefits have to do with the distribution of the economic costs. Ultimately, for emissions trading to mean anything, you have to reduce emissions, like in the total amount that's actually being emitted. So while they may be able to optimize the horrible economic inefficiencies that are being done, I actually think they're still quite large. In fact, Kyoto does already have a system of emissions trading. That is from whence that $500 billion annual figure is derived. So I don't think that's a solution for them, that's the problem. The third thing that they talk about is emboldening environmental opponents. This message that Kyoto is bad. Why would we repeal Kyoto? Because then we'll send the message that things like Kyoto are bad ideas. I really don't have a dispute with this argument. As much as I don't like a lot of Bush's policies, this is one issue in which I would be really happy to support his message getting wider sort of public acclaim. I'd rather these people be more prominent in the environmental community. People who are interested in thinking creatively and applying the market dynamics that the leader of opposition seems to have a little bit of an infatuation with, but not a very good understanding. With that said, let's go case side. The first thing that we talk about is the genius of the global market. And I didn't hear a lot of new stuff here that I didn't hear off case. I think all of this we basically responded to. The incentive stuff, he didn't believe in technological change, but also he gives us great examples of technological change. One thing that I think is really interesting is the example of fossil fuels. Everybody's worried about fossil fuels and how if we keep going at the rate we're going for a couple centuries, global temperatures will skyrocket. Well, the problem is fossil fuels are running out. We don't have a couple centuries of these products. That's why their prices keep going up. As the prices go up, so does the incentive to find alternative sources of energy. So thus, the genius of the market is taking the extent to which these are scarce resources that degrade the environment and impose costs upon us, and then using that cost to motivate change. The second thing that we talk about is how it's ineffective. And we say, look, no one is meeting their targets. They say, just meet them later. I've already talked about how, the fact that these countries are 20% over their goals is not just like they're 20% over, where they should be in 2010. They're 20% over where they should be right now to meet those 2010 targets. It's just not feasible for this to happen. So I think ultimately it does undermine the whole environmental movement. And I didn't hear any response at all to a very critical argument that Mike made. about how ultimately all of these products just move to the third world, right? Like, the third world is not covered by Kyoto. They get off scot-free. So all of the things that are going on in England and Britain, or England is Britain, and Canada, and other places that sign Kyoto, they're just going to migrate to the third world, or the United States of America, where they don't have these policies. Thus, often, first of all, definitely, we're getting no reduction in emissions. Didn't hear a good response to that, seeing as that's the linchpin of their opposition philosophy. But more importantly, in terms of the third world, a lot of these things are moving from places like the UK, where there's some environmental protection, to places like Bangladesh, where there's very little environmental protection, so it could actually worsen emissions. Please, please respond to these arguments. The final thing that we talked about is how it's unnecessary. It may not be optimal. Look, we don't know whether the current status of the global climate is the most sort of productive possible world, the most productive possible iteration of the global climate. What we hear from them is, oh, we should worry about these coastline cities. Again, an ad hoc argument with an ad hoc response. How many coastline cities are there in the world that are below sea level? Very few. So why not see what happens? Why not open up the door?
Thank the member of the government for his speech, and now call upon the member of the opposition to deliver the final constructive speech of the round, not to exceed 8 minutes in length.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Thank you to everyone on the panel, everyone in the House today, guys on Gov. It's always a lot of fun to debate with you. And Jed, it's been a lot of fun this weekend. All right, I just want to jump right in. This is the second time in about a month I've been in the international debating finals, but I feel like this time this time is going a little bit better for me. So we'll see. All right, I just want to jump into the case directly. Because I really, when they originally started talking about global warming, thought they must have some kind of alternative proposal. They must have some kind of alternative idea for how we might address some of this harms. But that must be the case. No, it actually isn't the case. The case is literally, let's do nothing about it, because in the long term, that's better. I think Jed tells you why this is an absolutely ridiculous position. I think I'm going to reiterate why this is an absolutely ridiculous position. And at the end of the day, I don't see how you can actually embrace this position if you don't want to have the entire world basically suffer from tremendous environmental catastrophes and for short-term economic problems to overtake any kind of long-term economic problems, to overtake any kind of short-term economic benefits. That's what I want to run into Jed's independent points. The first thing Jed tells you is about why the marketplace won't solve this on its own. Jed tells you that there is a conflict of interest and there is a prisoner's dilemma. I don't think John actually understood the argument, right? His first idea is that the market won't solve it. What John tells you in response is that the companies will be able to sell tools that will allow us to solve it, and therefore the market will be better off in the future. Number one, that's not a response. Number two, when was the last time we created problems so that industries could then solve them in order to develop economic growth? That's not viable as any kind of model of economic development. No, sit down. The next thing Jed tells you in some detail, though, is the idea of basically the prisoner's dilemma that actually exists here. The fact that you have two options. You can either cut emissions, or you can wait for sea levels to rise, and you can actually build these walls, and that these walls are actually relatively expensive to build. Look at the Netherlands. Look at what the Netherlands are dealing with right now and having to rebuild those walls over and over again because the dikes are crumbling. Look at the fact that we basically have to cover the entire eastern seaboard of the United States with these huge walls that would have to keep growing larger and larger and larger. I mean, I don't even know the implications of this. It's ridiculous to me. The response we hear is that basically, well, we can develop a system and export it. Okay. Number one, I don't even think this is the right response, but I think it's a pretty good response, is that basically, right, this has never actually happened in any kind of conceivable example. I think so the Green Revolution, where we kind of tried to export these genetically modified crops, was the best example of when this could have happened, but then you have to realize these crops went to American agricultural interest in Asia. They didn't actually benefit the Asian economies. I don't think we actually do frequently export these when we have a comparative advantage. We're actually able to reap some kind of economic benefit. But I'd also tell you, sit down, that at the end of the day, if your alternative is exporting walls everywhere around the world so we can have walls everywhere, or creating some kind of solution, what seems to me to be a pretty big problem. If I live in Boston, I'm going to look out my window and see a frickin' wall instead of the ocean. I mean, I don't think that's an effective solution to this problem at all. I don't think we should have walls along every coastline around the entire world. At that point, I think Jed's argument about how this does disadvantage to poor nations, and also Jed's argument about how these walls are inherently not an effective solution, are inherently incredibly difficult to build and incredibly difficult to maintain, and on the scale that we'd have to put them in place in the world, are probably never before even imagined. We hardly even know the scientific ramifications of putting these walls up. It seems a relatively ad hoc solution. The more important solution is to mandate people to avoid the conflict of interest and actually mandate people to work collectively to solve the problem on their own. They never respond to the underlying economic crisis that makes it impossible for the market to solve this. Therefore, they still don't know. Therefore, they still don't solve it. We still have all of these harms. We're still pretty much in the vein. All right, the second argument that Jed presents is how there's no feasible alternative. He tells you that Kyoto is important because nations have committed to meeting its standards, and therefore all of the alternatives you can work with within Kyoto, such as kind of an emissions trading program and all of that, work under the auspices of a general understanding and a general consensus that we have to target these problems, and everyone's in it together to target these problems. The response we hear is that basically, well, this kind of commitment allows failure. And maybe the failure we've experienced so far means that the environmental movement is also failing. This is also not actually responsive. At the point that you haven't met a basic standard established in an international treaty, the response, therefore, is not to junk the treaty completely and say, actually, we're going to put no standards into effect. It's to redouble your efforts to meet the standards in the long term, or establish some kind of framework under which those standards actually can be effectively met. This doesn't seem at all responsive to the underlying argument, no. And at the point that we're effectively, in this case, completely eliminating these standards whatsoever, then it seems that we're like, oh well, nothing's going to solve global warming, shit, the ocean's going to rise, we're all going to die, sucks for us. I don't think that's the appropriate solution at the point that we've shown you that these huge harms also exist, even though I do think that's the solution John's trying to advocate, sure.
You've accused us of not providing an alternative to Kyoto. What's the way in which we're going to redouble our efforts?
I know John wants to paint himself white. That's the alternative he gives you. We give you a better alternative. We tell you that not only can we include enforcement mechanisms that Jed said are currently lacking in Kyoto to sort of try to force nations to comply, but we can also implement a market trading system, which Jed tells you can also be incredibly effective. We tell you that you can do a whole host of different things within Kyoto, and we can also encourage nations to actually meet the standards of Kyoto. And the reason why emissions trading is actually a pretty great idea, and I think that this is something that John doesn't understand, is that John says this just kind of distributes the harms around a country, not if you limit the amount of pollution on aggregate that can be produced within the country to a level below that which is currently being produced. What it does is it incentivizes clean industry. It incentivizes clean power. It incentivizes corporations to be indistinctive and individualistic in determining solutions that allow them to save money in the marketplace. That's what Jed tells you we incentivize. Their incentivization is to get as dirty as you possibly can, because there's never going to be any governmental approach that's going to block you from doing whatever the hell you want, including the environment, and therefore the incentive is actually to increase the problem long term. The third argument that he gives you is about emboldening opponents. Apparently they want to do that. That's terrific. I guess this is underlining their whole global warming doesn't matter argument. We really shouldn't do anything about it. At the point that you believe that global warming matters at all, and I think that we've given you the harms that have never really been refuted, I don't see how you can possibly embrace this naive perspective. That's what I want to go to the flow real quick. The first argument that we hear is about the genius of the market. And Mike goes on and on and on about how the market is so terrific here, how basically, in the long term, Malthus and all of this stuff is going to make, sustainable development important for sub-Saharan Africa, and how this is going to be really terrific. I think Jed tells you all of the reasons why the market is actually ineffective in this case in having any kind of long-term solution. But I think another argument that Jed gives you that goes cold drop is this equity argument. Jed tells you that it's a lot more expensive in many cases for a government to become compliant in terms of some kind of international consensus solution, which is what they propose. They propose that, well, if the problem gets bad enough, we'll be able to get some kind of consensus solution to solve it, right? Everybody will finally decide at the point that water's rushing in their windows, maybe we should do something about global warming. Well, number one, that seems to be waiting until the problem already exists to solve it. But number two, it is more expensive at that point for a nation that doesn't have access to resources to implement these solutions than it is for a nation like the United States to do so. At that point, we see larger harms in Africa and in other underdeveloped regions of the world, rather than in the developed world like the United States and Europe. It might be great for us, it doesn't work for them. You can also cross-apply that to all of their analysis about how industry, for some reason, is going to flow to the third world as a result of this Kyoto. We want to eliminate that. I would also argue under that, though, that there are a lot of other things keeping industry in Britain and the United States, like economic infrastructure, the rule of law, effectively democratic and political and economic institutions. I have not seen a flight of big corporations into the third world beyond this kind of minor, manufacturing element. But that manufacturing element is not because of any kind of global warming solution. It's because of labor laws primarily, and that's why, for the most part, this is not actually a harm that we're going to see on our side of the house. Then we give you this argument in response to their whole idea about how basically, the system's a failure, it's ineffective, it's bad, blah, blah, blah. What they tell you, first of all, is that, the United States and Australia gain more industry because they're not signatories, that we see another kind of reverse problem. Instead of going to the third world, we see them going to the first world instead. I first of all think this argument is also relatively absurd at the point that we're going to be rewarding on their side of the house this kind of self-interested behavior. If the only way we want to establish a long-term solution is to encourage consensus, then we have to do that on our side of the house, and the only way to do that is to keep in place existing safeguards. And then the final argument they give you is about how this whole current global climate might be optimal. I loved Jed's responses to this. I thought they were brilliant. John only asked us, where are the cities on the ocean? Boston. New York, you're in San Francisco. I can go on if you like. All of these cities are actually on the coast. John apparently disagrees with different geography. That's okay. I mean, you can believe that. But you know, at the end of the day, I do believe that we actually do face a significant risk when these cities are in peril. There is no way to inherently believe that the world is going to continue to be a great place, to the point that basically a lot of people are living underwater. I do not believe they've ever told you why global warming will not continue an environmental problem, and we remain fragile, folks.
I thank the member of the opposition for his remarks, and we would now like to open the floor to floor speeches. Who would like to give a speech for Gov?
One back there. That guy.
Who's good?
I don't know that, but they're pointing back. Let's point.
All right, that guy.
Yeah, that guy.
What I think is really interesting about op philosophy is that they've never really given us harms to global warming other than rising seawaters. And while I think Josh has like real problems with large cement walls, I don't think this is enough for them to win the round. Now I'm sure like cement like prices will just go through the roof, and like this will cripple the global economy. Or that will end up in some sort of Waterworld scenario in which like Kevin Costner is trying to save all of us. And while it was a bad movie, a horrible movie, I don't think it's enough for them to win this round. And furthermore, while walls may be ugly and like aesthetically Josh may not be happy, I'll let Mike make that argument about aesthetics. So I want to basically bring up 2 points here. And the first is why a collective action problem doesn't really exist here, or they kept saying prisoner's dilemma, but it isn't actually a prisoner's dilemma. Because the way most externalities work is when someone is producing something and it harms other people, but not themselves. But in this situation, the pollution that people are creating also hurts them. Thus, the harms are distributed to everyone in the entire world. What does that mean? If you develop a solution to these harms, there's a profit to be had. And because greed is good here in New York and Wall Street, people are going to have an enormous incentive to develop these types of things. Just like the Japanese have had an enormous incentive to develop hybrid technology in, like, you know, the Priuses or whatever they're called, and how this actually is an incentive with like fossil fuels to actually get global warming under control. The second, I think, most important point is with regards to the third world. Because I really think Bob drops the ball here with regards to just how much industry is going to move to the third world. Because the third world just doesn't have any environmental regulations whatsoever, or even things like labor laws, or democracy, or any type of local industry that is actually going to be able to develop if multinational corporations are forced to move to these countries to develop their goods. More importantly, I think that the third world is just never going to sign on to Kyoto. And I think that in order for them to actually show that this is going to be effective, they're going to actually have to convince that this is going to be necessarily for the third world to sort of shoot off their chances at development and at any type of chance of agreeing to this sort of economic imperialism.
Here, here. All right, floor speech for the opposition. Over there. You're here. You have 2 minutes.
Thanks a lot. Let me just say, I haven't been debating a lot this year. I'm happy to see that we've ended up arguing the Kyoto Protocol because it's something actually I know a little bit about. The first thing I want to talk about is this point of externality. Don't worry, I'm not going to actually refer to what I know. The first thing I want to talk about is this whole point of externality. And I think it's really funny that they get up and they say, listen, there's not an externality problem. Do you guys know the tragedy of the commons? The idea is, if everyone takes a little bit, at the end you're fucked. And that's what happens in Kyoto. When you switch on your tailpipe, you're like, oh, it's only a little more gas coming out, like not a big deal. But surprise, when everyone does it, you're in big trouble. The way you get around that is by getting everyone together and agreeing to cut down. That's the idea. Without Kyoto, you don't have any incentive to develop new technologies. With Kyoto, you have an incentive for the new technology. But on this point on seawalls, because I think it's really interesting, this is like the big thing they think Kyoto comes down to. Like, at worst, we'll just build a seawall. Here's the deal. Global warming isn't like you move your towel higher up the beach when the water comes in. There's a lot of other really bad shit that happens. You get catastrophic storms. Areas become completely uninhabitable. You can't grow food where you used to be able to grow food. You know the Sahara? That used to be fucking arable land. That's what happens with global warming. The Midwest, you're pretty fucked. It's not like you can build a wall to make sure you can still grow grain in Nebraska. That's not how it works. But the last thing is on this point of the market solving. They say, it worked in Japan, the free market solved there. It's really interesting, because you know what happened in Japan? A bunch of people got together because they realized the market wasn't working. They banded together to try and get against global warming as a unified group. And do you know where they did it? In a little town that had a lot of problems from this called Kyoto.
right.
Brat.
Alright. I was really shocked that whoever had to defend the side that applies to this joke, didn't get up here and say that global warming is a myth. I have to balance that against the day after tomorrow, so I don't actually know which one of those is true. But I came up with a few lists, and I want to credit Greg Arthur and Chris Ford because they helped me very much with this, of ways I can stop global warming. The first is we can all leave our fridges open. A little bit away, might keep it cool. We can expand the ozone layer, or the ozone hole, to allow greenhouse gases out. I hear there's a scientist in Gotham who's got a wicked idea for a freeze ray. I think we can increase funding for ice cream production, though that has extra benefits, and giant sprinklers. They talk a lot about seawalls. Chris asked me if that was because Pat Buchanan has become increasingly worried about the growing problem of mermaid migration. I don't know if this is the case, but I think the bigger problem with seawalls is that Chinese industry has a lot of good technology for building walls, and they just zoom in. But the benefit would really be there'd be a lot less gang violence, because you wouldn't have to fight over which walls you were going to tag. Side-Off talks a little bit about the prisoner's dilemma, and Travis touches on this. He says this isn't a prisoner's dilemma, and I thought about it, because when I heard it in this context, what I thought about was like, you put Nigeria in one room, the US in another, and ask them to solve global issues, where the correct solution is to like kill Britain or something. I want to talk a little bit about painting flat surfaces completely white, because I think that's what Gove advocated, and there were a few problems with this. You don't know how to divide lanes on the highway. End zone markers become obsolete. The only way of telling if a professional athlete scores is if they take them up to a Colorado hotel room. Helicopters won't know where to land. Klansmen get the element of surprise. You couldn't find the Harvard campus. John Bateman is lost forever. Except there'd be this little patch of red. And you'd never know when it was snowing, which is, I think, a really great argument, because that's also a problem with enforcement. Because if you couldn't see the snow, you wouldn't know if you reduced temperature. Yeah. So finally, I want to close on something, because I think the leader of opposition is right, and this is something my entire table was talking about. As a table full of 5-year-old Jews from Minnesota, we too are very worried about global warming. And I really hope that in this round, world's finalist Josh Bone has told you how you can solve this problem.
All right. We now close the floor and move on to the rebuttal portion of the round. And with that, I would like to call on the most honorable leader of the opposition to deliver a speech not to exceed 4 minutes in length, reminding him that while no new arguments are allowed, new examples are always welcome.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think if there's one thing we can all agree upon, is that nobody on this stage should be deciding global warming policy. But I also do want to do one thing. I want to defend the prisoner's dilemma example. Perhaps I did not explain it. This actually might be a new argument, but I think you actually don't have to vote on it. The point is that it would be an optimal solution if all countries cut emissions. It's actually very expensive to build seawalls. When we say seawalls, we don't literally just mean walls, but it's physical measures of stopping the consequences of global warming in the country. So the point is that everyone should move to the bottom right corner, which is where everyone cuts emissions, but they're not because they should, because they built the walls. That's the prisoner's dilemma. That actually is a prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so basically what I think is that we all agree in this round that global warming is something that needs to be stopped, and it's something that has catastrophic economic consequences. I think, the fact that it's going to flood areas, coastal cities, destroy infrastructure, and so forth is never really contested. Additionally, what we tell you is that there's a huge equity issue at place here. The countries that are in the worst position to deal with global warming economically, who the market always leaves behind, the very, very, very poor people who have never been able to get on the train, that's the economic train in the north, those are the people who are uniquely threatened. So we think it is an issue that needs to be dealt with. We think actually the Kyoto Protocol shows that the issue is on the table, that people want to take steps towards it. So the question then is, will the market solve in this case? We've given you very good reasons why not, specifically the fact that it's a collective action problem. What's the way to solve a collective action problem? Well, you incentivize the kind of research they're talking about. How do you incentivize that research? You set a specific target that countries have to meet. So if you have to cut emissions by 10%, that's an an incentive then for countries to start developing economic technologies to do that. If you have to cut emissions by 20%, it's an incentive for countries to institute credit emission trading schemes to do that in an economically efficient way. Now they say you've missed some of these targets. That's true. But as Josh tells you, the solution when you miss a target is not to scrap a treaty. It's to redouble your efforts on that treaty. Even if Britain ends 5% above its 1990 levels in 2010, I don't understand why it doesn't mean they would still try to reduce below those levels in 2020 or in 2030. It's a long-term treaty. I don't understand why, because countries miss in one instance, they shouldn't continue to try and fulfill their treaty obligations in the future. I certainly don't understand why that means you junk the entire treaty. Furthermore, we talk about emboldening opponents. We think this is very important. It's not like you only push for Kyoto or you only push for technology. The two are interrelated. The people who support Kyoto are the people who support the policies they're talking about. The best way to embolden them is not to tear down 10 years of hard negotiating work that's just beginning to show its consequences, that's just beginning to pay off. It just seems very strange that because they might miss their targets, you would destroy the entire project. Finally, we give you the arguments that a lot of what they're talking about can be applied to Kyoto. The forces of the market, technological ingenuity, incredible profit opportunities in the West can be fostered and increased if you only set targets so that there's an incentive for countries to create that atmosphere in which R&D can take place. There's a tremendous incentive for Western companies to develop the kind of technology that reduces pollution for places like China and India, because even if they aren't signatories of Kyoto, pollution still destroys their environment, pollution still makes them economically inefficient. So we don't really see why Kyoto's a bad thing at the point where it promotes the things they're talking about. It's coming online, we know it works, we don't know that painting the earth white works, we don't know that building a belt around the earth is going to do anything. We do know that Kyoto has the economic, practical, and political tools to cut emissions. It also nets most of their benefits. I'm very confused why you would want to abandon a treaty that's just beginning to pay off, and it offers all these promises in the future.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition for his remarks, and now recall the Prime Minister to give the final speech of the round, not to exceed 5 minutes in length, again reminding him that while no new arguments are allowed, new examples are welcome.
All right, thank you very much, of course, once again. I want to talk about this notion of political consent, because a lot of the arguments that we get from side opposition allude to this notion that, well, we have a collective action problem, so we all need to sort of convene, come together to solve for this collective action problem in some way. Now, John actually responded to this argument. He said, well, the problem is you could actually use the political consent that exists now as people recognize the problem in the status quo to redirect efforts in some alternative, more efficient manner. There's no reason why that global consensus on Kyoto need be manifest in the manner that exists in the Kyoto Treaty. What they have to actually prove is not that Kyoto is the only place in the world where we could generate some kind of global consensus, but rather why Kyoto is in any way at all ever effective at reducing.
Madam Speaker, I just want to point out very briefly, I believe the argument that John just presented about how basically, oh yeah, Mike, sorry Mike, it's my fault. I feel that argument you just presented about this very, very long-term burden thing is completely and utterly new, has never appeared before in the round.
All right, well, the panel will take it under advisement, each member will make their own decision, putting time back on. Go.
Wonderful. Well, like I find it under flow, as John said, that we can use this political consent as it exists internationally to find other solutions. They didn't respond to it, so I believe them when they hear they think it's new. But I think what's really important here is that it goes beyond that, because I really just don't think this is a collective action problem in the manner as it's been posited by side opposition. Because what we've said from the very onset of this debate is, insofar as people with a certain economic interest in the status quo recognize that the status quo is unsustainable, if that is truly the case, then they will work together to try and create some kind of solution, and that itself is the market incentive. We give the example of Japan. They say, well, people got together to decide that. Well, of course they got together because they all recognized it was in their economic interest to develop these kinds of things, and they didn't need to have some kind of overarching framework by which they'd all agreed to reduce emissions. They could innovate through the market to provide real solutions that would solve the problems as they exist. So the first question I have to ask you is there any reason to think that Kyoto will forestall global warming? because I think it's pretty interesting that throughout this debate, we haven't heard word one why Kyoto will actually make good any of the problems that they've started. They've been very good at getting up here and talking about monster storms and huge walls all over the place. But they haven't told us why Kyoto does any good in preventing those things here. This is a problem because we got up here and said, it doesn't work. It doesn't do anything because first, no one's meeting their emission targets. Now, I don't mean the end emission targets. I mean they're not trending. They're not on track to meet their emission targets. I said I think only Britain and a few Eastern European countries, because the artifacts and the way the treaty was created, are on target to make it. But any country that's required to make real, actual, substantive economic sacrifices to meet their targets have not done so. And what John and I have both said is that there are real reasons for this because the costs are not being accepted by these countries. The only response we get to this is, redouble your efforts. I mean, man, I just wish I could use this argument for like anything, right? If something's not working, dude, just redouble your efforts, right? It'll solve everything. Of course, this doesn't actually mean anything. We all know why. So I'd also say that it's just silly to like pursue failure, right? Like, why redouble your efforts on something that analytically, as it's set up, will not solve the problem, given our second point, that it just moves industry off into the third world. And they say, this will never happen because there's no labor laws in the third world. First of all, this is clearly an incentive to move to the third world. And if you noticed in my speech, I said there's already a lot of pressure to move into the third world because of this outsourcing movement. And that if you tack this on top of it, an additional movement that is the reflection of environmental interests, then there will be a political backlash against things like Kyoto because people see it harming their actual economic livelihood. And that could damage the environmental movement as a whole. But more important than that, I also listed the United States and Australia, which do have infrastructure, which do have labor laws, which don't have any of the problems that they pointed out as reasons why people wouldn't pick up and move. They never actually made the argument of like actually having to move. They just said there are no labor laws. So that doesn't work. And like I said, this leads to higher emissions overall because you move from places of some regulation to places of no regulation at all. So their seawalls are needed sooner because they're not doing anything to solve the problem. The second question I have for you is, does Kyoto forestall a technological solution? Because what we've said is you diverted resources against a broader scope of thinking and arrangement of creative talent within the economy. Because what you've done is you've created incentives on a very narrow basis. Only along the dimensions of emission reduction does there exist an incentive to innovate in the status quo. John and I say it's nonsensical to restrict thinking just to pulling back from the things that we've already done. But what humanity generally does is find alternative solutions, alternative ways to utilize technology. We need to incentivize those things. And insofar as there is perhaps a problem that exists, that maybe the ocean will come up here and NYU and like Morgan Stanley and all the people in Lower Manhattan have an incentive to find a technological solution to the problem, we will find one. I actually gave you examples of them, and I do fall back on what I said to begin with, that the only reason why we look askance at them is because they're novel, not because they're theoretical.